We go. Good evening, afternoon, everybody. Welcome to ULT San Diego for the Aquarian series. This afternoon's presentation is entitled The Sphinx, which will be given to us by Dr. Eugene Jennings.
Well, thank you for inviting me to speak on the Sphinx. And as I just let Monica know, there was no real reading for this because I really couldn't find anything that I felt really fit the topic. There are scattered pieces of information throughout the SD, and actually, we're going to get to a document that Jonathan brought my attention to that was in Theosophy Trust that really does a good job in compiling those very references. But we wanted to do something a little bit different and even kind of challenge ourselves in the process. So this will really look at the topic just from three basic perspectives. One, just pictures. Two, a synopsis of the article itself in Theosophy Trust entitled The Sphinx. And then number three, where my mind went when I just went back to the SD and tried to do a root search for what this enigma might be. And the reading really points to the fact that the Sphinx, in and of itself, is a great mystery. And that mystery, in fact, is the mystery of life in its completeness. And hopefully, we'll show some of that before we're done. This second picture, again, is just, again, pictures of Egypt. I mean, for those that have been there, you know how beautiful it is. And on the left, we've got the Sphinx itself with some of the items that the author of the article brings attention to, such as the tablet, as well as what's left of this little marker here, which she indicates in the article when the sun shone on that marker, its length and size could actually be used to measure the Earth, as she says, taking into account the different levels of latitude from which such measurement was taking place. This third little picture is, believe it or not, um, a rock that can be climbed. And I say that because in my younger, kind of dumb heydays, when I went to Egypt back in the 70s, that was after running into Theosophy by book form and telling myself, yes, I got to go on this search. I got to go find out where these people are. So, whoever they are, because I had no idea of what I was getting into. But my first real trip was to Egypt. And this, again, was just my old poor photography of standing in front of the Sphinx and taking a picture of the pyramid behind it. That first picture shows all three pyramids. This was just a wonderful picture that I thought should be included. Just as you'll see in the body of the talk, there's another piece that's missing from this particular picture, but we'll definitely mention it. This is me, believe it or not, back in the 70s when I had in my, I don't know, daring, courage, or stupidity, literally climbed this pyramid.
Oh my gosh.
And in those days, they did not have the guards that were saying, you had to stay back and you couldn't, sit on the rocks and everything else. And I don't know what possessed me, but this picture here is representative of me on the top when the top had been leveled off, climbing up from side to side and really not having the sense to be afraid. But when I tell you, when you are on the top of this pyramid, I tried to go through some of my other photos and find the picture, but I couldn't. But when you're on the top of this pyramid, they have a ark that was buried alongside the base of the pyramid that was to carry the pharaoh to the other side. And that was huge. It was huge. But from the top of that pyramid, it didn't look any bigger than an inch. And I say that only to indicate the height of these pyramids. I mean, something awesome to be just in the proximity of, and definitely, I was up there by myself, just resting, as you can see, in my, I don't know what to call it. But again, got up there, and it's always harder coming down because you've got to watch. And if you are afraid of heights, obviously it's not a thing to do. Our next couple of pictures are just to show that the idea of the Sphinx is one that has been affiliated with many cultures. On the right, we've got one from India. Here we have one from Italy. Here, another from Milan. This one obviously is from Greece, and another one from Greece. And these are mentioned in the article from the Theosophical Trust in regards to the different kinds of sphinx that were in existence. Again, something that pertains more to world history than we think. We always perhaps think of the Sphinx in relation to Egypt, and rightfully so for a number of reasons, but clearly the idea was much more widespread. These are some others. This is just an art depiction. This is an Iranian Sphinx. And again, we're here with the Greek version of Oedipus and the Sphinx. And again, Oedipus and the Sphinx as depicted in that French version. And so the important point is whatever the Sphinx is, whatever it represents, is clearly something that is worldwide, and even goes beyond the world when we try to use that theosophical lens to look at what it represents. Throughout a lot of these Aquarian series, we've definitely been talking about things in respect to the ecliptic and the zodiacal clock, and obviously that is a part of the puzzle. But to point to the beauty of the article itself, and clearly the author, Miss Helen Valborg, I believe, at the bottom, did a wonderful job in capturing the different ideologies that were affiliated with the Sphinx. So she starts out her article talking about the Sphinx as the guardian, the watcher, the witness of all, and the fact that it embodies all elements of evolution, a sweeping statement and comment. And in parenthesis, I put how and why. For myself, as I read The Secret Doctrine, ISIS, or even this article, I'm always asking how and why. What is the process? Words can be misleading. They can also be indicators, but they are also very limiting. And so when we see a word, we typically think of it as, for instance, the watcher. If we're theosophical, we might think of that watcher as the watcher that sits on the threshold. If we're not theosophical, we might even think of it as somebody that's watching a watch, or someone that's a peeping Tom, or whatever. Interestingly enough, and this is an important point that pertains to even everyday phenomena. You will only think within the bubble in which you believe. If your beliefs are limited, your thoughts must necessarily be limited in order to conform with your beliefs. Otherwise, you will be disturbed. And we typically do not like to be disturbed. We prefer to rest. Theosophy, on the other hand, is such a universal teaching that it doesn't allow you to rest with just one interpretation or one version of a word. But when we think of these, guardian, watcher, witness of all, embodies all elements of evolution, we say it is sweeping and inclusive because if all elements of evolution are involved, there is nothing that can be left out. She then goes into sharing with us the different types, again, as we've seen some of the pictures of the Sphinx that she identified throughout the SD and throughout history. Some of the symbology related to the Sphinx in terms of the body of the lion, the strength, the wisdom, power, um, the netherworld, interestingly enough. I mean, most folks, when they think about the Sphinx, they think about the riddle. But where does the netherworld come in? Again, the astronomical, zodiacal, and she says geodetic, i.e., the measurement of the earth, the different, what we include in that circles of the earth, and how they relate to those zodiacal images, and what all of that points to. Obviously, HPB talks about in the Secret Doctrine the divine hermaphrodite and how that is symbolized in the very image of the Sphinx, the human head and the body of an animal, no matter how royal that animal, as representing the Luna Patrice on the one hand and the Agniswada or the Solar Patrice on the other hand, or the divine incarnation of the reference back to that watcher and witness, or the other version of that is the great initiator that descends during the early part of the third race. But we'll make more reference to that. That is followed up in her article by understanding the lion as the initiatory animal, and she implies the phrase masters of initiation. Obviously, then we're moving down to the quote from HPB in The Secret Doctrine that the sign of Leo hides the true esotericism of what the divine flame, the fiery lions, and the lions of life truly mean. And she calls that the dark nucleoli. And I would have had an E in there like she had, but spell correct continued to correct it, so I just gave up. She then mentions in the article itself several keys. Later on, she mentions 7 keys, not specifying what they are, but she mentions that 2 of those are the psychological and the physiological. And that brings us to an important point when we're looking at the Sphinx, that there are more than obviously one way to interpret what it might mean. And we emphasize again for ourselves what it might mean because really outside of a science of symbology based on universal principles and facts that are well known and subsequently demonstrated to those that might be initiated in that particular system, anyone else does not know what the creator of those symbols meant. And so, as we do this talk, we cannot say with any certainty, as anyone else, unless they are perhaps from that theosophical version initiated into that divine wisdom that these symbols represent. We cannot say what they are, but we can, using the hints that HPB gave us, point to what some of them might mean. Then she speaks about the one God, its 7 principles that are reflected in humanity, that are reflected in cosmos, and she gives an example of the Egyptian terms used for those 7 principles. And then she mentions, which some may find surprising, the incomplete but nonetheless appropriate application depending upon the phase of application of the spiritual life in Mahat, Ahamkara, plus the 5 tamatras. So most will see Mahat and Ahamkara as relates to the Sankhya system. And typically after Ahamkara comes mind. And then there are the various divisions. But herein we have the five tamatras. And so there's something else that's implied here, although it's not really spoken of typically in the Sankhya system as such, but it is definitely a teaching that relates to some of the pseudo occult sides of interpretation of these types of teachings in different systems. And then what happens when you fail to answer the riddle correctly? And that failure to answer the riddle typically resulted in death. End of story. So that article is very comprehensive in its brevity. If you want to know anything about the Sphinx, I would suggest reading that article, identifying the points that she makes, and searching those points out in The Secret Doctrine and in Isis Unveiled. And when you finish, you will have more than enough to go on. Let me see. Can I? Nope. I cannot do it the way that I wanted to. So this then is that transition over the next couple of minutes, and I cannot do this in a very short period of time. So really what I will suggest is I wanted to wet your whistles, so to speak, with a different version of what you've just identified in the article, but also what's in the secret doctrine and what it points to. And so the way this slide was developed was in a sequential manner. So the only thing you would have seen when you, if I had done it correctly with the sharing, the only thing you would have seen when this slide came up was the enigmatic Sphinx. And the implication of that is, as per HPV, there is so much there that is held in speechlessness and silence that it just begs the intuition to unfold what's held within. And so you will see that we arbitrarily just put together 12 different phases that might relate to the Sphinx. And so as the slide was moving from one phase to another, first, this would have come up. One life, one law, one gold, homogeneous to complex, all interdependent. And that's just a little reminder that no matter when or what we talk about theosophically, we're only talking about one thing. We're talking about life in its ultimate phases according to its own laws that are inherent within its motions. And so that is the one truth in its experiential, awakened, and awareness state that all of the mysteries point to. That one breath works from the homogeneous stage of its substance principle. That would have been the next ground and substance principle that comes up. And it is within that substance principle or that ground. And we have ground here first because the Sphinx sits on the ground. If you go back and remember these pictures, you will see that the Sphinx is not something that was made on top of the earth, but was actually something that was carved out of the very earth that revealed its shape. And there's a little story slash myth slash whatever of the individual that was sleeping by just the head of the Sphinx and had a dream that the Sphinx told him, if you dig out the rest of my body that had been covered up by sand over the years and years and years, that you will become king. And so allegedly he dug it out, and sure enough, eventually he became king. But again, the importance here is that this ground substance, this substance principle, is a unity and yet in its own unique sense of duality. And that terminology that's always used by HPB, by T. Subbarao, in some of the articles pertaining to things like this is that adhisthana, the active force that is inherent within the vehicle that carries it. The two are not separate, they are one. And so that force, that life, that motion, that substance, that great breath, that absolute substance in absolute motion, all of that is inherent within this ground. And so to put this beginning in perspective, we now have to go about remembering that all truth in theosophy is universal. And so when we are looking at something as enigmatic as a sphinx, and the author of the article pointed to that idea as well, we have to be careful. If there are seven keys, so to speak, whatever those keys are, there are multiple ways of seeing one thing. So if we're talking about the Sphinx, we can talk about it from a cosmic perspective. And that would be the first book, Cosmogenesis, in terms of what that might represent, its place. Or we can talk about it from an anthropogenic point of view, or we can talk about it from a psychological point of view, or we can talk about it from a spiritual perspective, or we can talk about it from an occult perspective. And when we use the word occult, we are simply referring to those aspects of science that HBB tells us were lost, but will be found, some of which have been found already, such as astronomy. So we can look at it from an astronomical point of view. We can look at it from an astrological point of view. And there are differences there. We can look at it from the perspective of chemistry, which relates to the five tamatras that were mentioned from that article. Or we can look at it from the perspective of the totality of the symbol. The totality of the symbol, when we look at it from this ground substance perspective that is more universal, contains more than just the Sphinx. If the Sphinx comes out of the ground, the Sphinx is what has been shaped out of that material. All things in the universe have been shaped out of the essential substance principle or that homogeneous material. But in relation to the Sphinx, we have the sun. Why? The Sphinx is an east-west configured statue. It looks at the eastern horizon, and behind it is the western horizon. But between it and the western horizon, as you've seen from the picture, is the pyramid, depending upon one's perspective. So minimally, when we're talking about the Sphinx, we have to think about the ground that it is one with, its imagery and body, the sun that it watches and waits for. It is the watcher. It is the witness. And that temple of the pyramid that is behind it. And you'll see here we have the netherworld as part of the picture. Why? Because that is what is under the earth that it rests upon. So once we move from that universal ground substance perspective and we identify within our own minds what level of application we are going to work with, cosmological, astrological, astronomical, are we going to do it from the occult side? Are we going to do it from the spiritual side? Are we going to look at it from the metaphysical side? Are we going to look at it from the mystical side? Or are we going to look at it as HBB tells us from the esoteric side? All different visions, all different views, all different differentiations. That's our second part here. When we're talking about differentiations, again, cosmically, we can talk about the seven skins of the mother. Or as we work our way around this circle, we can talk about the different differentiations of force. We can talk about differentiations of substance. We can talk about differentiations of principles. Doesn't matter. What matters and what remains important is that we anchor ourselves into the point of view and the application that we are making at this time. Otherwise, there's too much there, and the symbols themselves will be conflicting. But once we begin to work with the differentiations, and for instance, we have here Prakriti, that's one level of differentiations with its gunas. The tamatras that were mentioned in the article are another level of differentiations, and those tamatras exist in their sevenfold nature, and they give rise to what are considered to be the subtle elements, which then give rise to the gross elements. And out of those elements are generated the formations in terms of bodies, in terms of vehicles, in terms of pranas or winds or whatever. So again, once we talk about the differentiations, and for those that have read the article, HPB's Secret Doctrine 140, I'm sorry, 400 something, the seven creations, you'll see this very similar beginning, that before the ground, she has force. Once the ground is there, then she speaks about the differentiation of those elements from that homogeneous ground. But depending upon, again, what level we are working with, elemental levels, chemical levels, as in our mundane world, the tamatric, as in the subtle elements, or the prakritic, which, if you think of that Sankhya system, Prakriti and its gunas at that level give rise to, as she indicated in the article, Mahat and Ahamkara. And for those that have read 5 Years of Theosophies, another interesting article by HPB, The Sevenfold Divisions, and how that relates to the esoteric understanding, you will begin to see how that can be applied psychologically, mystically, and the beginnings of what that occult approach might be. But once we get the ground and the elements, and I may not be able to go all the way around this circle, so based on time, because there's so much that's wonderfully useful to discuss, out of the elements, we can begin to form things. And out of this is formed the Sphinx. As we look again at these pictures on the side, the Sphinx is there, the pyramid is there, the setting sun is there, but also on the flip side is the rising sun on the eastern horizon. And when we look at that Sphinx, the question is, how do we again want to understand that Sphinx? If we look at the body of the Sphinx, it's a lion's body, i.e., an animal's body. It's got four limbs plus a tail, which gives us that interesting number 5. Leo as a sign is number 5. T. Subarao, in his article on the zodiac, tells us that the 5 holds the promise of everything else that comes out after it. And for him, that 5th sign gave rise to the 6th, which was the Virgin. That 6 gave rise to the 7, which were the 36 tattvas. Those 36 tattvas gave rise to the idea of the thought of cosmos prior to the next four-fold division that had to do with the Prajapati or the creative forces, the actual manifestation of those, the 14 lokas, and the elements, interestingly enough, out of order, but nonetheless there. So the Sphinx in its body, looked at as the sign of Leo, can mean one thing or many things which are wrapped up there. The Sphinx as the sign that hides the esoteric division. Again, if we go back to Subarao's article, the first four he defines as obviously the absolute. The second has to do with, actually, let me just read his rendition of that from his article, The Zodiac, which that is found in the Theosophical writings, but he tells us in a summary version, the fifth sign. Let's see. Okay, the first is the self-existent, obviously pertaining to the absolute in one of its aspects or forms. The second is pranava or om. And again, we have to be careful with the use of that term because sometimes it means one thing, sometimes it means the other, but we can probably be safe with understanding it as the breath itself. The third is the androgynous stage, or the two in one. Again, the force and the substance, or Parabrahm in Mulaprakriti. And the fourth is the sacred Tetractys, or the manifestation of those three generating that fourth, which now moves it forward to the subtle side of cosmos as it relates to thought, mind, and divine ideation. And so this idea of the Sphinx in and of itself and the esotericism within the sign of Leo opens up a whole vista of possibilities that can be looked at cosmologically, again, anthropologically, philosophically, mystically, occult, esoterically, etc. Now, the Sphinx, in terms of yeah, since we're running out of time, always asks the question, and there are several versions of that question, but we'll stick with the old one. What is it that is on all four or has four legs in the morning, two in the afternoon, and three at the end, or in three in the evening? And interestingly enough, I mean, most folks couldn't answer that. I probably couldn't have answered it either. And then guess what? The Great Sphinx would devour them. And so, how do we want to look at that? What's four? What's two? What's three? Well, the first thing, what is the Sphinx? The Sphinx, and we didn't talk about the top part of that, which is the head, or that which represents manas, or the gradual awakening of mind. What we like to think of as the mane, the lion's mane, which is, again, if we're reading the secret doctrine and we understand how the initial gods descended from Mahaloka, M-A-R, I'm sorry, Maharloka. And with their auras, as she tells us in the SD, gave up their higher shadows to the human animal form. Again, we're back in that territory of understanding the Agnishwadas and the mysteries related to the Luna Pitris as coming together at a certain portion in the cycles of time to generate a living spiritual, whoops, sorry about my balloons again, a living spiritual being in an animal body, which we still are. And what we should recognize about the riddle is that the Sphinx, in its animal nature, devours. The sign of Leo in the Gnostic Pistis Sophia, HPB tells us, represents the king of Kama. the highest desire, but still part of that lower four planes, unfortunately. Not the Kama Deva, but the Kama as a power that Pistis mistook for the higher light because of its beautiful light. And if we get caught up in Kama, we get devoured, period. And so one aspect of the Sphinx is whoever cannot use the light of mind, the lighting up of manas, instead of the animal nature, to truly begin to understand the mysteries, they are bound to be devoured and to be recycled in matter. And then this idea of 4 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and 3 in the evening is an interesting one. But if we play with the numbers in an anagrammatical form, what do we have? 432.
Oh.
That is one of the basic numbers for the cycle of the Mahamanvantara. We're talking about the 432 digits for the Kali Yuga, times 2 for the next Yuga, times 3 for the duration of the third Yuga, times 4 for the duration of the fourth Yuga, times 1,000 for a day of a day of Brahma, I believe it is, or I'm sorry, a day of the Manus, and then the 14 Manos multiplied by those same digits and numbers gives us another great cycle. So if we can't answer the riddle of the Sphinx, we are forever caught up in the cycles. We are forever caught up in the days and nights of Brahma. We are forever caught up in the duality of nature. If we flip those numbers around, 2, 3, 4, and we recognize that there is only one truth, now we're looking at the Pythagorean triangle. 1 giving rise to 2, giving rise to 3, giving rise to 4, which is no different than Subarau's absolute, giving rise to the pranava in terms of its dualistic motion, which then gives rise to that threefold and subsequently to that fourfold. Or we can look at those numbers in terms of that one circle that we're looking at, one life, one law, one gold, giving rise to the Atma-Buddhic vehicle that it uses. And that giving rise to that Atma-Buddhi Manas vehicle that it uses, but that's still not being able to manifest unless it comes in through, again, the tamatras and the elements or the Prakriti. The Atma-Buddhi belong to the higher elements of Prakriti if we're going to use that particular system, and they manifest, just like page 200 in the Secret Doctrine, through the lower four planes. The archetypal, the creative and intelligible, the formative, and the physical. Those are the planes of the subtle to the gross elements that then generate all of the forms, including and beginning with the elemental, through the mineral, through the vegetable, through the animal forms, i.e. Sphinx, and then into the human animal form that can accommodate the light of the Kumaras, or the threefold, sevenfold, divine monastic energies, lights, forces, whichever way you want to describe it, that can take up their abode within the being to give it the light of intelligence. So when we're doing riddles and numbers, that 2, 3, 4, 4, 3, 2, 3, 2, 4, depending on how you want to work these and how you want to apply them, really have great application in all of those aspects to the teachings. You can't go wrong with those numbers. And they do equal that 9. And At the end of the nine is the culmination in that 10, which then brings us back to the threefold logi and the sevenfold principles. And so again, all of these connect us to truths in nature. But if we're going on, we said that the Sphinx looks at the eastern horizon. It's waiting, it's watching, it's there at the dawn, and it sees the rising of the sun. And so if it's using its intelligible nature, again, it's asking its own questions. It's asking its questions about the sun, about what that sun is, about what that sun is composed of. And as we look at the idea of the sun, we cannot look at the sun similar to the Sphinx, the triangle, and the sun without looking at the earth as a body and the moon as a body. Now we're in that domain of astronomy and astrology. And we can't really look at those without looking at the ecliptic or the zodiacal houses and then the degrees. And we can't look at these without going back to 432 in terms of the cycles and the numbers and the sidereal cycles of each sign and the degrees per sign and how many times those signs are experienced in the rotations of the earth around the sun through the signs, and these related to the pole stars. And we put an S there because everyone is, for the most part, familiar with the precession of the Earth's little cycle there. And so it's not in a one point position always, but it's circling. And depending upon the terrestrial north and the celestial north and that circle, it has its own circular, you might even think of it as a drain, little motion that sucks in, for lack of a better way of saying it, the influences of the pole star as it's going through its cycles and as it's moving through those larger cycles. So when we're talking about the ecliptic, when we're talking about the sun, we can break these down into the solar rays. When we talk about the seven solar rays, we have to talk about the seven forces. And those forces we know just from a standard point of view, if we use the SD as a beginning, not as an end, but as a beginning, we're looking at the Parasakti, the Janasakti, we're looking at the Ichasakti, the Kriya Sakti, the Kundalini Sakti, and we're looking at the Mantra Sakti, those forces that have to do with sound, light, electricity, magnetism, heat, motion, and the force of intelligence itself. We typically think of that as brain-based only, but that's because of our limitations, not understanding the nature of consciousness as it relates to thought, as it relates to intelligible force, as it relates to ideation, all different. But again, as we're looking at the ecliptical signs, whether we're talking about Leo, whether we're talking about Virgo, whether we're talking about Scorpio, and the relations in terms of their juxtapositions, in terms of their conjunctions, in terms of what influences they are truly supposed to be spreading from the occult or the esoteric side. Therein lies the understanding of astrology in the higher sense of the term. And when we then introduce the polar influence, the pole star, we can think of the pole star simply in a metaphorical way as the pituitary of the brain. And we know that the pituitary of the brain sends out all of, depending upon the signals it receives, all of the hormones that relate to the different glandular systems, endo and ecto, of our body that make the body itself develop and mature, which then relates to the cosmic development and maturation. And these cannot be seen without, once we're back to the numbers, understanding the rounds, the races, the sub-races, the senses that go along with them, the forces that are accompanying their development, the substances that are awakening, all that take us back to, again, ground substance principles, etc., differentiations. So we're talking about nothing less than a science, all of which is interrelated and interdependent. We mentioned the netherworld here because when the sun goes beyond the horizon and goes below the western horizon, it lights up the netherworld, i.e., during certain initiations, as in the king's chamber. You know, we spoke about, as we'll see in a moment, the pyramid, and what that holds. But the netherworld gets lit up. And just like the Buddha went and preached and, gave sermons to all of the elementals and to the demons and everything else, and as Christ descended and rose during those 3-day periods, this netherworld of whether we call it our unconscious, our subconscious, whether it's the after death states, the transitions that occur. Again, if we think about page 200, not only do we go down to the fourth, but that upper can be seen as the subjective side. So there's the higher subjective, and then below that fourth, there is the lower subjective. And when we look at Pistis Sophia, we see that borne out very, very clearly. When we look at the 33 or 34 realms of the Buddhist, we see that those 6 or 7 lower ones are the underworlds. When we look at it from a theosophical perspective, we talk about the Kamaloka, the astral, we talk about Avicii, we talk about the eighth sphere. Then the flip side of that is about the Devaconic states and those that might be higher than that. So again, all of these ideas and their polar opposites, no pun intended in regards to the pole star. There's that northern pole star, which means that there's that southern pole star from the other side of the hemisphere that has its own constellations that it's reflecting, and understanding the dynamics of the sun, the solar winds, the North Pole, the aurora borealis, the flux of the electromagnetic energies into the earth and out of that earth. Now we're looking at a very comprehensive system of astrology, astronomy, and solar winds as it relates to the zodiacal clock and as it relates to the pole star that depicts a science that we have not yet discovered or rediscovered, but is there waiting. Our next step then is the pyramid, and I'll make this quick. The pyramid then, if you've ever been in it, there's a long ramp that you've got to go up. It's a very narrow passage. It's black. The first stop is the Queen's Chamber, which is white. And in that Queen's Chamber, it's kind of small. I forget whether or not there was a bed or flat there out of stone. But after you leave the Queen's Chamber, where the lesser mysteries were allegedly taught and revealed, you go into the King's Chamber. The King's Chamber is all black. If I remember, maybe it's 10 by 10 or something like that. And in the off to the middle is a huge sarcophagus tomb, black, looked like onyx, and a carved out space for a body to lie. And in that, HPB tells us, occurred the higher mysteries. And also in that king's chamber in the pyramid is a little hole, literally in the wall. And the story is that that hole would align with the pole star. And as the influence of that pole star came in during those initiations, I guess things would happen. And so all of these things point to the next little button on the circle, evolution. We know that when we're talking about the lunar Patrice and the solar Patrice, we know that when we're talking about the elementals, again, using that Article 7 creations um, in the secret doctrine, we know that the monad begins in previous manvantaras in that lowest form, works its way up through the elemental forms, works its way up through the forms of the elements, or we might say atoms and combinations of um, molecules and organs. Excuse me, not to mention viruses and bacterias and protozoa. All of those are parts of life necessary for the creation of the human form itself. And then at a certain point when the solar Patrice can link up, because the lower Kumatas have what is called an astral body or aura that can link up with the comic, the higher do not. And so they can only piggyback on the lower. But those lower are still so much higher, even though they are failed Dhyani Chohans. And we have to put the word failed in quotes because it's definitely not a failure that you and I would typically think of. But it turns another place in the wheel in terms of the overall evolutionary purpose and overall evolutionary goal. And that's where we have the role of the monad, because it is the monad itself that HPB tells us that does the assimilation and the awakening, not the evolution. The monad does not evolve per se. It is the only permanent thing that we can ever think of in its Atma Buddhic form, as we are told in the Secret Doctrine, as well as in the footnotes, as well as in some of Subaral's works on consciousness and immortality, etc. The only permanent thing that does not change in the conventional sense that we're looking at change. And so she tells us that the role of the monad, as we've seen in the proem of the Secret Doctrine, at the human stage is self-devised, self-induced pursuit. And that self-devised and self-induced pursuit really begins with that Sphinx that we've been talking about, assimilating all of the knowledge that these elements provide for it in terms of experience. And we can end up with a paraphrase of the quote that she gives us that's kind of always inspiring for this student. And she says, these are just prelude words. In its silence, the Sphinx tells us. But in HPB's words, every form on earth and every speck or atom in space strives to become the monad in its absolute totality, an awakened condition, not evolved, as the culmination of the divine incarnations on earth. And there's a lot more to say about the Sphinx in terms of its symbology and things of that nature, but we've already spent a lot of time talking. So we'll put an end to it there and leave a few moments for questions if there are any. Thank you, Monica. And let me stop share.
I
Thank you.
guess,
Jean's going to take, I'm sorry. Jonathan's going to take over from here.
Okay, thank you.
okay, all right. Wow. Oh, before we get to Laura's question, I just wanted to express my profound gratitude for really just waking us up with the hidden side of nature and just taking on this incredible journey through everything, really. But just
That's
the
what she said, right? She said
right?
everything.
Right? The panoramic vision all the way from the cosmic pituitary all the way to well, just to all those archetypes that you took us through with spirit and matter and the grounding and I can't remember everything on that whole circle on that slide, but it was from the cosmic, but also I just had a question. Um, you got me thinking, and this is the mark of a great presentation when you just arouse like thousands of questions per second, you know? Um,
I
but
thought it was the opposite.
but one of these thousands of questions has to do with the Watcher. And we hear about that incredible, awesome, unfathomable idea about the Watcher in the Secret Doctrine, which itself is just so enigmatic. But also has this idea of compassion built into it, and patience and just understanding of the human condition. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about maybe the Sphinx within us, and you did when you circled around to the monad and the journey and the assimilation and the awakening and so forth, rather than the evolution. But the watcher within. I was another thing that just occurred to me is the Sphinx who's always looking to the east, because in a way that's where the wisdom comes from. But also the sun is the cause of everything. So there's this watcher that is within us that is always mindful, it seems, of where wisdom is and what the true source is. And I would think that that would be a way that we could kind of all relate in a way to this amazing enigma of the Sphinx.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, for that question and answer, yes. It's a way that we can all relate. And the interesting thing about the Sphinx looking east and taking that role of the watcher, in again in its animal nature, in its human nature. And what we didn't talk about is not only does the Sphinx watch, it becomes.
Hmm.
And so it went through, as HPB tells us, that entire ground. It went through that Mula Prakriti, through that Prakriti, through those gunas, through those formations. And then it goes through the sun itself, both in its physiological manner, if we just look at glands and hormones, or in its astral manner, if we're talking about chakras and rays and forces, and in its solar dynasty manner, i.e., the teachers talk about the Nirmanakayas that are truly global figures. They are celestial figures, because some of those, as planetary spirits, are, as she says, awake through the periods of obscuration when the entire earth has shut down as if it were sleep, to ensure that the laws themselves continue.
Hmm.
Then the greater circle is the circle of the pole star. We don't talk about that cycle of monadic expression and development. But that is there too. I mean, we have to perhaps enlarge in our view of what we are, as opposed to animal forms that simply limit what we are. And so, if we can embrace the understanding of the universe, we cannot be any less than the universe itself. And so, that watcher element within us, the witness element, we didn't get to go into the idea of the witness as the Akashic principle of our being that records all of those inner truths that we can get access to as our experiences rise up to those levels, which embrace wider circles of experience and understanding outside of the human animal domain. And so that watcher, that witness, and yes, the witness, the spiritual ego. And that's what we can relate in one respect to the pole star. The spiritual ego itself that amasses the full record of all of the incarnations. Buddha, under the tree, allegedly, um, had that vision of all of those past lives, all of those experiences. And we can't have that without an understanding of the knowledge gained, both good and bad. And so when we evoke the idea of the witness, again, it is something much greater than what we conceive ourselves to be as human, but that is more what we are than the human form or human animal form that we use, that we are so quick to identify with and validate anger and rage and misidentification and separation and prejudice and being divided by ideas that don't even exist in reality.
Hmm.
So we are trying to rise above our delusions. We are trying to rise above our ignorance in terms of the nindanas. All of the lectures have mentioned the nindanas in some respect. These cycles around that circle are also reflective of those same 12 nindanas, beginning with ignorance, going through the samskaras and the action elements that are analogous to the gunas, that are the formative factors of all existence. So again, to invoke the witness and communicate with it, to invoke the spiritual ego, to invoke the watcher aspect of ourselves, all different names, probably for a similar principle. But when we get in touch with that, it radically alters not only our understanding of what we are, but our points of view concerning what's even important. But that's the beauty. So hopefully that puts it a little bit more in the ballpark of how that relates to us, which would be part of the psychological mysteries of our being.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay.
It's very, can we make comments or not?
I'll tell you what, go for it. Normally, you see those hands in the thing? Normally, people raise their hands and then they do it, but go for it. Why don't you go ahead and ask a question, Brina?
Oh, okay. I just wanted to say, in all this thing that we've heard from Eugene, so well expressed, we can see Helen Blavatsky's being so influenced by the Vedas, the Hindu texts from 3500 BCE, and the words you've used. The words you've used are words that she's used that are like the loka, which means the world, the maha, which means the big, prana, which means the breath, yuga means times, atma is soul. Prakriti is an interesting, but I don't want to get into that. Prakriti is a very interesting concept because it's from Prakriti that all these elements have come and have joined together and created more and more complex forms.
Mm-hmm.
So I appreciate that. I didn't know there was that much Sanskrit in there, but Sanskrit words and the old language are old. It's still, it's still used, Sanskrit. It's the root language of many, many other languages, Latin and Sanskrit. And I'm sure, I haven't read the Secret Doctrine, but I'm sure that it's peppered with Sanskrit.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you very much. Indeed. Indeed it is. Indeed. And we would just say that hole in the pyramid, HPB tells us, they watched the pole star go around 3 times, which means that although they give it 4,500 years or so of existence, she says it's more than 70,000 years of existence that race bear witness to the rotations of those cycles. So I'm sorry, Jonathan, or who's
Gene, just one thing. Technically 4 minutes is the time for our meeting, but in this case, I don't know how much energy you have and time that you have, either one of those.
Uh, they,
but
they, I'm
I'm
not
willing to
dead,
keep.
so don't worry about it.
Okay,
At least
I,
yet.
I'm willing to keep this meeting open for a very long time. So it just depends on your energy level and your
I'm good.
time.
Thank you. I'm good.
Shobha?
Or Laura was, I'm sorry. Yeah, Laura had popped up and then Shobha popped up, I think.
Yeah. Well, I think you answered the question very well, Jean, and in that one comment. And in not understanding the 432 and being able to answer the riddle, it seems like I always saw the death as a lost opportunity. In other words, your inner life is going to remain a mystery. If you didn't see your inner life reflected in the Sphinx or the numbers, that maybe there is a loss. And the same thing for another incarnation. You're going to have to wait. And I often think that HPB was like the Sphinx. How many people saw their potential through her? How many people saw what they could accomplish through her? So I think the death is not so much of the physical body, but of the opportunity.
Great, thank you. And that brings in another point we couldn't get in when we're talking about the witness, the watcher, the Akashic sheath. We are definitely talking about karma. And the one thing that we can take some solace in is that no one gets by the Sphinx that has not evolutionarily deserved to get by the Sphinx. It's not a matter of good deeds. It's a matter of that moral and ethical, intelligible development that provides insight into those secrets of nature. So the Sphinx, by devouring us, sends us through that cycle again, such that we get to understand the gunas. That's what the Bhagavad Gita is all about. That's not a real loss, because if we haven't developed to the point that we understand them, then we should go back. I mean, that's like saying, we're doing calculus, but we don't know geometry. It can't work. So we've got to go back. We've got to build the structure. And from a theosophical point of view, it's got to be built correctly. So the Sphinx, as part of that karmic law, as it relates to our principles and our sheaths, is a necessity that is inherent within us if we recognize that we are the three fundamental propositions. Because law is inherent within the very fabric of the universe, which is the very fabric of our being. But thank you. Shobha.
Yeah. Uh, Thank you so much, Eugene. I'm chewing on all this, and my jaws are hurting still. I just wanted to point out, you showed a picture from India, but I was thinking of Narasimha, which is the opposite. It
That's
has
correct.
a face of a lion and the
Right.
body of a human. So, do we consider that as a Sphinx as well, or where do we place Narasimha in this?
And so, I mean, let's look at it from a theosophical point of view, because there's history and convention. And in my little notes, I put, this is where conventionality ends and theosophy begins. So if we're flipping it and we've got a human body with an animal head, then what can that perhaps represent? I mean, if we're looking at it from, for instance, the Dendera temple, the zodiacal aspect of that temple, then we're looking at the astrological layout and we're asking ourselves what constellations are conjoining. If we're looking at it from the human perspective, we might simply say, what is the nature of the animal that is ruling my consciousness that has control over my body? If we're looking at it from the psychic perspective, we might ask ourselves, what are the hidden powers that that hawk, eagle animal has? What spectrum of light does it see into? What ray does it identify with? Because we know animals react differently to the entire electromagnetic spectrum. And some of them see in the ultraviolet, some of them hear in the ultrasonic, some of them do the infrared. And so therein lie scientific hints in regards to the powers that are being developed in that human frame, some that may be animalistic, but some that may then, on the flip side, represent godlike powers. So again, it takes us to the voice of the silence where we have to be aware of the lower idis and what they can tune us into, and perhaps look at it from the point of view of switching genres for a moment. Jesus Christ, seek ye first the kingdom of heaven, and then all things will be added unto you. When you first truly acknowledge the absolute, then Prakriti and the gunas are not an issue. As HPB tells us in 5 years of theosophy, Prakriti, the gunas, avidya, and desire, in essence, are the factors that keep us bound, that keep us locked into incarnation. So again, we can pick apart the elements of the symbol very much like, we didn't talk about the body of the Sphinx, but the body of the Sphinx can represent the entire transformative process because it takes in the food through, I think Ken, a couple of weeks ago, spoke about the cow, goes through the cow's digestive tract. Well, that digestive tract is a symbol of the entire metabolic process of evolution. Eventually, we get rid of the stool, we pee out the toxins, and hopefully we absorb the nutrition that sustains our true imperishable body, as Krishna says. And so, again, depending upon what level of application we're going to use, whether we're doing the cosmological, whether we're doing the anthropological, whether we're looking at it from the chemical, whether we're looking at it from the point of view of psychic forces, or the rays of the sun, or the rays of the entire spectrum. Those are different levels of application that these animals that align with these particular rays due to their habits, their habitats, and their characteristics are conveying to us through that symbology.
Gene, is there,
Yes.
can I enter just one thing here, just as a footnote to what you mentioned? I'm thinking of the Narasimha symbolism. HPB was mentioned by Laura to has been Sphinx-like because she's so enigmatic. We just don't understand her. And then I'm thinking of the lion is regal, right? And in a way, it's spiritual royalty, you could think, could say. And then a judge said that she was possessed of the wisdom that belonged but to lions and sages. So that's an idea. Just kind of as a footnote. And then also this idea of, well, what about the lion head and the human body? Maybe it would be like the sage almost masquerading as a normal human being, and using a human form to deliver a message, like a messenger. But it's really a sage. So just as a footnote to what you already offered.
Great, thank you, thank you. And that takes us right back to the esotericism hidden deep within the sign of Leo. Because if
yes.
in fact that is being reflected in the mind of the being that's using an animal form to teach us, as the early teachers did. Again, that watcher in relation to the third root race and those that were set aside, and the great initiator that still is, due to the understanding of that wisdom that pertains to our principles, is definitely hidden within that sign. So again, from that perspective, it dovetails well with what you're saying there in terms of a great teacher.
Thank you.
Thank you. Desiree, yes.
Hi. Good
Hi
evening.
there.
Hi there. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. And I especially appreciate the fact that you remind us all that everything is one at the very beginning.
Otherwise, we get confused.
We do get confused. And it's when you at least start with that first truism, when you do get into the aspects and start searching out the truths of these individual concepts, they can come together versus not coming together or conflicting, which they will anyway. But it's very helpful to start with that one main truism. Thank you for that. I also wanted to just mention that the number 432 is also claimed to be the that natural vibration that resonates with nature.
Exactly.
So, and it's interesting about anagrams anyway, because we tend to look at numbers so linearly that it's an interesting technique just to take those numbers and move them around and see, what they're forming, what they're telling us, because they are living entities in nature, those forces. We represent them by the glyphs of numbers, but they are living forces. So it's, but thank you for that. It was a wonderful presentation. And yes, I've heard about HPV being referred to as a Sphinx. But when I think about HPV in the Sphinx as you presented today, I keep thinking about the verb awakening, that we're going through this awakening process. And somehow it just, in terms of the lion and Leo, has to be related to that creative force of Brahma, that pushing forward. I don't know, but thanks again so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you for those ideas. And truly the circle in that point, the circle in the logos, is what gives rise to everything because everything is integrally there. I mean, HPB says it's there in the beginning before the manifestation. We see the pieces of it, which is no different than the pieces of our body when we do the medicine thing. We look at the heart, we look at the lungs, but they all work together and they all need each other. And so that structure is a beautiful structure and a great example of oneness. And the universe is no different. The universe is no different. But thank you definitely, because when we're looking at those numbers and we learn how to correlate those vibrations with those numbers as they relate to the fourth plane and the third plane and the second plane, and then take them into the oneness of our being, that's, again, another way of saying that we've completed the circle.
The universe does rotate and the universe does vibrate at 432 hertz. So
yes.
we know that.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That's okay.
It's very exciting. That's why I'm talking.
Yeah. A lot of science. Yes. Ewan? Ewan.
That's correct. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Hi. Yeah, hello from New Zealand.
Oh, welcome. That's quite a ways.
I'm glad to see that your lodge has not been pinched off you by T.S. Adya.
No comments.
But they're trying to do that in New Zealand. Anyway, now this 432, of course, is supposedly the number of years of the age of Kali, which we're supposedly in now, since the death of Lord Krishna. Now, Sri Yukteswar looked at it and he said, oh no, it's only 24,000 years, the full cycle of the yugas. You have rising and descending. You see, so according to him, we're on the rising of Dwapara Yuga at the present time. And it kind of gives more hope. I don't like the idea of 432 years of Kali Yuga.
Well, again, thank you for that. But we should.
Have you looked at that at all? Have you any thoughts?
I've not looked at that author. No. Just
that's Yogananda's Yogananda's master was he was a very good astrologer. In fact, that was his main hobby apart from being enlightened. and and he said that the yugas did not involve, millions of years, but they're actually within the cycle of the sun going around the zodiac and the precession, the equinox, as I understand it, and which takes, on the average, 24,000 years. They devised the system, or he cognized the system, where they spend, say, maybe 3,000 years or so in Kali Yuga. Then it rises up to Dwapara, Treta Yuga, and then Satyuga, and then down again. Also, and it's all within the containment of around 24,000 years, which makes things a bit more hopeful.
Well, I thank you for that comment. I mean, I tend to lean a little bit more on something that HPB alluded to in terms of hope. And she says the zodiac and the constellations only apply to the lower nature. The higher nature, that Atma Buddhi Manas, is related to the Dhyan Chohans themselves, who are behind the forces that fixate the universe. And so if we are living the best life that we can, we'll just generically state it that way, then we are not resonating with the lower quaternary of our being. And so what we go through simply becomes an experience we know, we watch, and we appreciate. It's neither good nor bad. It's simply an experience. The interpretation is liberation. When we are liberated in our mind, we can interpret any event in any way we wish. And that is what something, I think it was Viktor Frankl, while he was in the Nazi Germany camps. I think the story goes, and it's, I didn't hear it firsthand, but he said to the Germans, you can do anything you want to my body, but you cannot tell me how to interpret it in my mind. And so the ideas of Kali Yuga and Kritya, etc., are good ideas, but they can also be traps. Because when we believe them too much, whether they are true or not, according to Yogananda and the example you gave, we believe they are such. And again, like we mentioned in the beginning, if we believe something to be true, even if it's not, our entire world experience is going to be based on that belief. And then we limit ourselves. That wonderful ring pass knot that HPB said belongs to the universe, we inherit it and limit ourselves unnecessarily. And if we limit ourselves, we can destroy those limitations as well and embrace, as she says, all thought, which is universal thought. And then the cycles are simply the cycles. So what? We do the best we can in a cycle. Nothing else is asked of the soul. But again, if our vision is limited, then we will interpret the entire experience with that limited vision. And the Sphinx looks to the sun, experiences the pole star, and in the pyramid itself, the chamber of mysteries, the three sides are 12, the base, 4 sides times 4, and the 1 point brings us to those 49 fires of initiation that align us with and beyond the pole star itself. So again, our thinking, I think, what did Buddha say? We are made of thought. Our experience is based on thought. Unless we understand how to move beyond such limiting thought. But Thanks again. So for the hope side, go beyond your thinking. And, we can look at things and see things differently. Doesn't make it easy necessarily, but it makes us wiser. Uh, thank you, Jeff.
Thanks. Thank you.
Whoops, you zapped on the mute,
Yeah,
Jeff.
oh yeah. Yeah, there was a lot of things to think about in your talk. One of them about 432, and you mentioned also 234. I think you could go up or down either one. I mean, I think they're talking about the cycle. You go down one, up the other. I mean, I don't see why, 234 is more, like ascending. But if you add them, you get 666. So 666 is the cycle. That's certainly one meaning of 666. Is what, Revelation is a description of what happens at the end of a cycle.
Mhm.
And the cycle devours itself, so to speak, and then 6 + 6 + 6 is 18. 18 being in Kabbalah Chai, the number for life. Life itself is a cycle, at least, cyclic life is obviously the cycle. Um, there's some difference in Greece and Egypt as to whether the Sphinx was a male or a female or both or neither. What was a non-binary? So, and that's in understanding what the you're the yeah, and understand what the in astrological terms. I'm wondering if it's Virgo Leo. In Phaedrus, or I don't know how, I guess you say that in English, one of Plato's dialogues. He mentions it's the one where they're circling around Zeus and the other gods are circling around heaven. It's a cycle. But there's one god that stays home, and that's Vesta, the Vestal Virgin. And so that is, and this isn't just an idea that starts with me. The idea that it starts from there and then returns to Vesta. It starts going backwards, just as the precession of the equinox would.
Right.
So we can look at one. At least this is one ring. As you said, there's many ways to read the Sphinx, but I think that's one of them. It's not simply Leo, because Leo and even in Subra, I think has a different meaning. It's Leo is sort of the universal savior in the cross of balance. From what I remember of that article. So and yeah, I wondered, the most famous, passage in Greek literature, of course, is Oedipus. Oedipus. Now you said that people don't get by the Sphinx unless they evolutionarily deserve that. So do you think that Oedipus evolutionarily deserved to pass by the Sphinx?
And again, for me, I mean, just like you've already indicated, I mean, I would not try to say it out of context because, what I've learned from theosophy is that anything out of context can be denied. So, I mean, in one respect, I mean, depending upon how you're looking at the dialogue, even who is Oedipus? What is Oedipus?
Well, that's what the was asking him.
Well, I mean, there's a question and there's an answer, but then we can take it to a higher level, especially within a lot of the Hindu texts, when it would be such as Mulaprakriti is asking Parabrahm, or Shakti is asking Shiva, or Sadasiva is asking Shakti. Again, all different levels, which will render different interpretations and different responses.
Yeah, but then you just get a lot of interpretations.
I don't think so, because I think that the basis, if theosophy is true, it has to be a science that is demonstrable. End of story. If it's not, it's a waste of everybody's time. And so depending on who is asking, once again, perfect, there is going to be the search. There is going to be the awakening. There is going to be, let's use the analogy of alleged meditation. When one has an image that they are meditating on and contemplating on, if it is genuine and authentic and aligns with one of the truths of nature, I mean, it's like Desiree said, these are insignias that represent truth. Numbers are squiggles, and yet they are squiggles with power because they represent something deeper than the squiggle that is a truth in nature. And when we resonate with that truth, no matter what the squiggle, we achieve an awakening to knowledge that can be demonstrated and reproducibly demonstrated at a particular level of one's being, whether we're talking physically, whether we're talking psychically, whether we're talking spiritually, whether we're talking at the divine level.
Well, I mean, you're just making a claim that it's science, right?
Yeah, that's all. It's science, period. Science is about knowing, but knowing is about reproducibly demonstrating. So if the planetary spirits, the way the Mahatmas describe them, exist, they are demonstrating their knowledge when they present themselves in that third round to awaken manas and instruct them in the laws and the sciences to initiate their cultural developments. That's a very practical learning about the land, learning about the agriculture, learning about the animals,
Yeah.
learning about the cycles, etc. That has value. And so, again, depending upon where Oedipus is, where the Sphinx is, what level of truth one is seeking, what questions are being asked, based on what knowledge is necessary, therein lies the dialogue. For me.
It seems also that the Greek Oedipus is part of the Greek tragedies, and like the Shakespearean tragedies, they're absolutely enigmatic. We just don't know. And so, in one way, Oedipus is an enigma who's talking to another enigma, the Sphinx. So we just have to rejoice and enjoy that we don't know, because this opens up all of our vistas to it's a wonderful thing to say, I just don't know, but I'm willing to learn. And it's the most healing and regenerating thing it seems that one can say to oneself. Do you want to?
And can I just say, Jonathan, on that note, but
Yeah.
it should be liberating as well.
Yes. Thank you.
Should be, yes. Because if we never learn the trap that we're in, we can never escape it and then help others escape it as well. What was the movie? The Matrix?
Yeah.
Oh gosh. And I think Maluka's been waiting patiently, and then you can shut me down.
Oh, hi. Good afternoon, everybody.
Hey.
Thank you. Very instructive as always. I was thinking, that I was reading recently, and HPB talks about that this old Earth, obviously, it's not one of the sacred planets. Obviously, number 8, she called it the planet of the death. And after all what's going on, you wonder, yeah, for sure, it's the planet of the death. And she also mentioned there were other type of beings or races much different than ours. So we are not the new kid in town, obviously. Or we might be a new kid of town because of that. So we sometimes are so arrogant to think that, like, here we are. They are obviously beings, races. I don't know what you want to call it. they have been going through this planning much earlier than all of us. So we are at the bottom now, and probably the most grotesque, probably of all races of development. And the way we behave is obviously is very much an example of that. So did you talk about these the yugas, right? So I'm wondering, when we get done and go back to the golden age, is that it? Or we start a new ABC again of a different cycle? Or is that going in a spiral? Is that endless? I'm just wondering.
And thank you for your comment. And I believe that you got the answer in the question in terms of the spiral. One thing that always humbles this student is I always like to zoom out. And so I zoom out from the Earth to the solar system, and then I zoom out from the solar system to the galaxy. Then I zoom out to the galaxy to the galaxy clusters, and then I zoom out to the universe, and then I zoom out to the multiverse. And I ask myself, can it be that on this earth, as you suggest, we are the epitome of knowledge and wisdom? And the simple answer is no. There are greater degrees of what the teachers call subtle organizational structures that manas as a power can be invested in for learning. This human animal form is not it. And so when we embrace the cosmos in its n-dimensionality, that leaves a lot of space for further understanding. And it might be similar to our understanding in terms of all of the sciences that we have in one person's head versus the knowledge that one of that person's cells have in relation to the organ in which they live. It doesn't compare. So, as you suggest, the evolutionary cycle is spiral and open. If the absolute is boundless, then what limits our evolution is the circumference of our true nature. If the circumference of our true nature enlarges, then we have more to understand. And Theosophy tells us that that is exactly what happens. So yeah, there's much more.
There is
Donna.
a clarification offered by David Grossman in the chat. He says that HPB does refer to the Sphinx as the divine hermaphrodite and the witness, and then it says see SD2, so second volume, Secret Doctrine, page 124. Thank you very much.
Indeed, and that would be related to the section we're speaking about in terms of that watcher, that third root race, the awakening of Manas, and the divine descent in order to help that process get started. So thank you, indeed. Okay.
Well, Gene, thank you. You have done what a gift. Thank you for putting so much into this and for giving us so much of the harvest and the fruit of your meditations on this and contemplations on this enigmatic, I shall say, topic. So thank you all very much for coming. And next week we will hear a presentation. We're going to begin a series that has to do with the voice of the silence, where once a month until the end of the year, we'll be taking up one of the paramitas, the first of which is Dana, and that will be offered by Ken Small and a week from today. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Gene, so much for doing this.
Thank you. Thank you.
Presentation.
Bye-bye.
A lot of fun.